The ancient leather-bound diary slipped from Jonathan Roumie's trembling hands and hit the monastery floor with a sound that echoed through the sacred silence like thunder. The actor who had portrayed Jesus Christ to millions of viewers around the world stood frozen in the dimly lit Polish chapel, his face drained of all color, tears streaming uncontrollably down his cheeks as he stared at the yellowed pages now scattered at his feet. What he had just read in Saint Faustina's personal diary, written in 1937, was so impossibly specific, so supernaturally precise, that it shattered every rational explanation his mind desperately tried to construct. The Polish nun had described him by name, detailed his entire journey as an actor, and revealed intimate prayers he had whispered alone in his apartment, prayers no other human being had ever heard. But she had died in 1938, 46 years before Jonathan was even born. Father Tomasz, the elderly priest who had traveled from Krakow specifically to show Jonathan this discovery, watched in reverent silence as the revelation broke over the actor like a tidal wave. The priest had witnessed many powerful moments in his 50 years of ministry, but nothing compared to watching a man encounter proof that God had known his name, his calling, and his deepest struggles decades before his first breath. "She saw you, Jonathan," Father Tomasz whispered, his own voice thick with emotion. "In her mystical visions, Jesus showed her your face, your work, and the millions of souls you would touch. She wrote it all down, and we have kept it hidden in our archives, waiting for this exact moment." Jonathan couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't process the magnitude of what he had just discovered. His entire life, every rejection, every moment of doubt, every tearful prayer asking if he was worthy to portray Christ, suddenly reframed itself in his mind like a divine puzzle finally revealing its complete picture. The monastery walls seemed to pulse with an otherworldly presence as Jonathan's knees buckled beneath him. He had come to Poland 3 days ago expecting a simple meeting about Saint Faustina's devotion to divine mercy, perhaps to learn something that would deepen his portrayal of Jesus in The Chosen. He had no idea that he was about to encounter the most profound spiritual confirmation of his entire existence. The diary entry wasn't vague or symbolic like typical mystical writings. It was terrifyingly specific. She had described the exact small apartment in Los Angeles where he had lived during his darkest years of struggle. She had written about the night he almost quit acting forever, the night he knelt on his kitchen floor and begged God for a sign. She had even documented the precise words of the prayer he prayed every single morning before stepping onto the Chosen set, a prayer he had never shared with another soul. But what destroyed him completely, what had caused his hands to lose all strength and drop the precious diary, were the final lines of her entry. The words that Saint Faustina claimed Jesus himself had spoken to her about Jonathan Roumie, a message meant specifically for him, written 87 years before this moment. A message that answered the one question that had haunted Jonathan since the day he accepted the role of portraying Christ. A message so personal, so powerful, so impossible to have been written by human knowledge alone, that it could only be explained one way. God had seen him. God had known him. And God had left him a letter in the past, waiting patiently through decades of history for Jonathan to finally arrive at this monastery, in this chapel, on this exact day, to read the words that would change everything he thought he knew about his purpose on earth. The story of how Jonathan Roumie discovered this supernatural message began 3 weeks earlier, on an ordinary Tuesday morning in Los Angeles, when his phone rang with a call from a country code he didn't recognize. 3 weeks before Jonathan Roumie would find himself on his knees in a Polish monastery, weeping over words written before his birth, he was sitting in his modest Los Angeles apartment, exhausted from another overnight shoot for The Chosen. The early morning sunlight filtered through his curtains as he knelt beside his bed in prayer, as he did every single morning without exception. His routine never changed. He would thank God for the opportunity to portray Jesus, then he would ask the question that haunted him daily, the question that made his voice crack with emotion even when no one was listening. "Lord, am I truly worthy to represent you? Please, if I'm getting anything wrong, if I'm not honoring you properly, show me." He had no idea that this exact prayer, these precise words spoken in the privacy of his bedroom, had already been written down in a diary in 1937 by a Polish nun who would never live to see television invented, let alone streaming platforms or The Chosen. Jonathan's phone rang just as he finished his prayer, the screen showing an unfamiliar international number with a country code he didn't immediately recognize. Normally he would have ignored it, assuming it was spam, but something made him answer. The voice on the other end spoke English with a heavy Polish accent, introducing himself as Father Tomasz Kowalski from the Sanctuary of Divine Mercy in Krakow. "Mr. Roumie, I apologize for calling so early in Los Angeles," the priest began, his tone carrying a weight of barely contained excitement. "But we have made a discovery in our archives that concerns you directly. It involves Saint Faustina's private writings, entries that have never been published, and we believe you need to see them in person." Jonathan sat down slowly, his post-prayer peace suddenly replaced with intense curiosity mixed with confusion. "Father, I'm honored, but I'm not sure I understand. How could Saint Faustina's writings concern me? She died in 1938. The priest's response sent a chill down Jonathan's spine. "Mr. Roumie, that is exactly why you must come. What she wrote should be impossible, yet it exists in her own handwriting, dated and verified. I cannot explain further over the phone. This is something you must witness with your own eyes, and I believe with your whole heart." The conversation lasted only 10 minutes, but by the end of it, Jonathan had agreed to fly to Poland the following week. Father Tomasz had been insistent but kind, mysterious but genuine, and something in Jonathan's spirit recognized that this was not a call to ignore. "I have been a priest for 50 years, Father Tomasz had said before hanging up. "I have studied Saint Faustina's writings my entire ministry. But what we found 6 months ago in a sealed section of her diary, hidden away and preserved, it changed my understanding of how God works across time. You will understand everything when you arrive. We have been praying for this moment, for you, for 3 years." After the call ended, Jonathan sat in silence for nearly an hour, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew of Saint Faustina, of course. Every Catholic did. She was the apostle of divine mercy, the humble Polish nun who had received extraordinary visions of Jesus and had written them all down in her diary, which became one of the most widely read spiritual books in the world. He had even read portions of it while preparing for his role in The Chosen, finding her descriptions of Jesus's mercy and compassion deeply moving. But he had never studied her writings in depth, never imagined there could be any personal connection between himself and a saint who died decades before he was born. That evening, instead of sleeping before his next shoot, Jonathan began researching Saint Faustina's life with an intensity that surprised him. The more he read, the more unsettled he became. Born Helena Kowalska in 1905 to a poor Polish family, she had entered religious life at 20 and spent her short life in obscurity, working in convent kitchens and gardens while experiencing profound mystical visions that she carefully documented. She died of tuberculosis at age 33, the same age Jesus had been at his crucifixion, never knowing that her diary would one day be read by millions. But what gripped Jonathan's attention as he scrolled through article after article in the blue glow of his laptop screen were the documented instances of her prophetic accuracy. Saint Faustina had written about future popes by description years before they were elected. She had described technological advances she couldn't possibly have understood. She had detailed people she would never meet in life with stunning precision, people who would later confirm her descriptions were accurate to the smallest detail. Jonathan's hands trembled slightly as the taxi wound through the ancient cobblestone streets of Krakow, passing Gothic churches and medieval buildings that had stood for centuries. He had landed in Poland that morning after a sleepless 13-hour flight, his mind unable to rest as questions circled endlessly through his thoughts. What could Saint Faustina have possibly written about him? How had Father Tomasz and his team known to wait for him specifically? And why did the priest sound so certain that this discovery would change everything Jonathan understood about his calling? The gray October sky hung low over the city as the taxi pulled up to the Sanctuary of Divine Mercy, a beautiful basilica complex that housed Saint Faustina's relics and original writings. Jonathan paid the driver with unfamiliar Polish currency, grabbed his small travel bag, and walked toward the ornate entrance, feeling as though he was walking toward a divine appointment that had been scheduled before he was born. Father Tomasz was waiting at the door, exactly as he had promised. The elderly priest was smaller than Jonathan had imagined from their phone conversation, with deeply lined features that spoke of decades spent in prayer and study, but his eyes were sharp and kind, filled with a knowing that made Jonathan feel simultaneously comforted and unnerved. "Jonathan," the priest said warmly, embracing him like a long-lost son rather than a stranger he had never met. "Thank you for trusting enough to come. I know this journey required great faith." As they walked through the sanctuary's quiet corridors, Father Tomasz explained that he had been the archivist of Saint Faustina's writings for over 30 years, responsible for cataloging, preserving, and studying every page she had ever written. Most of her diary has been published and translated into dozens of languages, he explained as they climbed a narrow stone staircase. But there were certain entries, very personal and prophetic in nature, that the church decided to keep sealed until the proper time. "We have always believed that some of her visions were meant for specific people in specific moments, not for general publication." They entered a small private room lined with ancient books and religious artifacts, the air thick with the scent of old paper and centuries of prayer. Father Tomasz gestured for Jonathan to sit in a simple wooden chair, then carefully placed a protective glass case on the table between them. Inside was a small, worn notebook, its pages yellowed with age but remarkably well preserved. "This is one of Saint Faustina's personal prayer journals from 1937, the priest said reverently. It was kept separate from her main diary, more intimate, more raw. 3 years ago, I was going through our sealed archives when I found this particular journal in a section I had never fully examined. When I began reading it, I nearly fell from my chair." Jonathan leaned forward, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Father Tomasz opened the glass case with careful, practiced movements and turned to a page marked with a red ribbon. "Before you read this, I need you to understand the context. In late 1937, Saint Faustina's health was failing rapidly. She knew she was dying. Her visions during this period became more intense, more focused on the future. She wrote extensively about what she called the apostles of the latter times, people who would spread the message of divine mercy in ways she could not imagine." The priest's voice dropped to almost a whisper. On November 12, 1937, she had a vision that she described as seeing through the eyes of Jesus into a time beyond my understanding. She wrote that Jesus showed her a man in a future age who would portray him in what she called moving pictures that speak. She didn't understand what that meant. Cinema was barely known to her. Television didn't exist. Streaming platforms, the internet, none of it had been invented. Father Tomasz paused, his eyes glistening with emotion. "But she saw you, Jonathan. She saw the chosen. And Jesus told her things about this future man, about his struggles and his prayers and his heart, and he gave her a message to write down. A message that would wait in this archive for 87 years until you walked through our doors." Jonathan felt the room spinning slightly. "Father, how is that possible? How could she see me?" The priest smiled gently, sadly. "The same way she saw everything else that came true. God exists outside of time, Jonathan. To him, 1937 and 2024 are the same moment. He can see the beginning and the end simultaneously. And sometimes, rarely, he allows his chosen messengers to see across time as well." Father Tomasz slid the open journal across the table. "The entry is in Polish, but I have prepared a translation for you. However, I want you to see her original handwriting first. I want you to know this is real, not something we fabricated." Jonathan looked down at the page, his vision blurring slightly as emotion welled up in his chest. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, the ink faded to a soft brown, the Polish words completely foreign to him but somehow feeling sacred, heavy with meaning. At the top of the page was a date, 12 listopada 1937. November 12, 1937. 47 years before Jonathan was born. "Now," Father Tomasz said quietly, placing a typed English translation beside the original journal. "Now you may read what she wrote about you." Jonathan's hands shook as he reached for the translated pages, barely able to grip the paper as waves of holy fear washed over him. Father Tomasz sat back, giving him space but staying close enough to offer support when the revelation inevitably became too much to bear alone. The room grew quieter, the air itself holding its breath as Jonathan began reading the words Saint Faustina had written 87 years ago in this very city while tuberculosis slowly claimed her life. The translation began with Faustina describing her vision. Today, after Holy Communion, Jesus transported my soul into a time far beyond my death. I saw a world I cannot comprehend, where people carry small glowing boxes showing moving pictures and connecting souls across vast distances instantly. Jesus told me, "This is the age when my divine mercy will reach the ends of the earth, not through missionaries traveling by ship, but through light and sound carried on invisible waves." Jonathan's breath caught. She was describing the internet, smartphones, streaming technology, impossible for her to understand in 1937 when even basic television didn't exist. She continued, "Jesus showed me a man portraying my Lord in these moving pictures, and I saw millions upon millions watching him, souls from every nation, many who had never set foot in a church. Jesus told me, through this man's obedience, I will reach hearts hardened against me. I will use his face to show them my face, his voice to speak my mercy to a generation dying of spiritual thirst." Jonathan's vision blurred with tears. The Chosen had reached over 700 million views worldwide, bringing the Gospels to people who had never read a Bible. But how could she have seen this? His hands trembled violently as he continued. "Jesus showed me this man's journey, and my heart broke with compassion for his suffering. I saw years of rejection, doors closing in his face, opportunities slipping through his fingers like sand. I saw him in a small dwelling, walls bare, cupboards nearly empty, wondering if he should abandon his dream entirely." Jonathan's chest tightened painfully. She was describing his 20s and 30s exactly, the years in Los Angeles taking any small acting job, living in a tiny North Hollywood apartment, eating rice and beans for weeks, questioning every day whether he had heard God's call correctly or had deluded himself into pursuing an impossible dream. "I saw this man on his knees on a kitchen floor late at night, alone and weeping in darkness. He cried out, 'Lord, I cannot do this anymore. I have nothing left. If this calling was from you, please give me a sign. Show me I have not wasted my life chasing a fantasy.'" Jonathan's hand flew to his mouth to stifle a sob. He remembered that night with perfect, painful clarity. March 2017, 3 months before the audition that would change everything. He had been on his kitchen floor at 2 in the morning after another rejection, praying those exact words. No one knew about that night. He had never told anyone, not his closest friends, not his family, not even his spiritual director. It was a moment between him and God alone. Yet here was Saint Faustina, writing about it in 1937, 80 years before it happened. Father Tomasz handed him a tissue without speaking. Jonathan wiped his eyes but couldn't stop the tears as he forced himself to keep reading. "Jesus told me the name of this man. He said, 'His name is Jonathan, and he will carry my presence to the multitudes. But I must first break him of all pride, all self-reliance. I must strip him to nothing so that when he portrays me, it will be me they see, not him. His emptiness will become the vessel for my fullness.'" The words hit Jonathan like physical blows. He had always wondered why it took so long, why God made him wait through so much pain. Now he understood. It wasn't punishment. It was preparation. The poverty, the obscurity, the desperate nights, all designed to hollow out space in his soul for something greater than himself. But the next paragraph broke him completely, sending him sliding from his chair to his knees on the monastery floor, the pages falling from his hands as his body shook with sobs. Father Tomasz retrieved the papers and continued reading aloud, his own voice thick with emotion. "Jesus spoke directly to me and said, 'Faustina, write this message for Jonathan. He will read it many years after you have come home to me. Tell him that every morning when he kneels and asks if he is worthy, I hear him. His humility delights my heart. I chose him for this calling before the foundation of the world, and I am preparing him through every joy and sorrow. When he puts on the robes and stands before cameras, I am with him, in him, speaking through him to reach my lost sheep who would never listen to a priest or read a Bible, but who will watch because it is good storytelling, and there I will meet them." Jonathan was on his hands and knees now, forehead pressed against the cool monastery floor, unable to contain the overwhelming flood tearing through every defense, every doubt, every insecurity he had carried for years. Father Tomasz knelt beside him, one hand on Jonathan's shaking shoulder, and continued through his own tears. "Tell Jonathan he is not an actor playing a role. He is a priest ministering my presence. I am pleased with him. His daily surrender blesses me. His prayers of unworthiness are more beautiful to me than the confident prayers of those who think they have earned their callings. And tell him this above all. When doubt comes, when the enemy whispers he is a fraud, tell him to remember this moment, these words written before he was born, and know with certainty that I who began this good work in him will complete it. His calling is secure. His purpose is ordained. And I will give him grace to fulfill it until his last breath." Jonathan remained on the monastery floor, unable to move, his entire body trembling as divine confirmation pressed down on him like a physical presence. Father Tomasz stayed beside him in silence, knowing that sometimes the most profound prayers are too deep for words. Minutes passed as Jonathan's sobs gradually quieted into breathless wonder. When he finally lifted his head from the cold stone, his face was transformed. The burden of doubt that had shadowed his eyes for years was gone, replaced by something that looked like freedom, like a man just released from a prison he didn't know he was in. "Father," Jonathan whispered, his voice hoarse, "how do I carry this calling now that I know with absolute certainty it was ordained before time began?" The elderly priest smiled gently, tears glistening in his eyes. "You carry it the same way you've been carrying it, Jonathan. With humility. With daily surrender. The only difference is that now, when doubt whispers you're not enough, you have an answer written in a saint's handwriting to silence that lie forever." Jonathan looked at the glass case containing Saint Faustina's original journal, the faded ink somehow glowing in the soft light. "May I see it again?" Father Tomasz carefully placed the journal directly into Jonathan's hands. The weight was surprisingly light, but Jonathan felt as though he was holding something infinitely precious, a tangible connection between earth and heaven, between his human doubt and God's eternal certainty. As Jonathan's fingers traced the yellowed pages, something extraordinary began happening in that small monastery room. The air grew thick with a presence both men immediately recognized, the same gentle but overwhelming love Jonathan felt on the chosen set during the most intimate scenes. Father Tomasz gasped softly and crossed himself, witnessing what could only be described as a supernatural manifestation of divine affirmation. "Do you feel that?" the priest whispered in awe. Jonathan nodded, unable to speak, as different tears began flowing. Not tears of broken surrender, but tears of overwhelming joy, of being seen and known and loved by the God who had written his story before the first star was hung. "He's here," Jonathan managed to say. "Jesus is here right now, confirming these words." The presence grew stronger, filling the room with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with heaven touching earth. For Jonathan, it was the answer to every prayer he had prayed, every question he had asked, every moment wondering if he was truly qualified. In that moment, wrapped in divine embrace, Jonathan understood with perfect clarity that his worthiness had never been the question. God's faithfulness had always been the answer. The calling was real. The preparation through suffering was purposeful. And the impact would be far greater than he could imagine because it was never about his talent. It was about his willingness to be a vessel, and God's power to fill that vessel. "Jonathan," Father Tomasz said softly, "there is one more thing in the journal entry I haven't shown you yet. After Saint Faustina wrote Jesus' message for you, she added her own words, a personal note to you from her heart to yours." The priest turned to the final page where Faustina's handwriting changed, becoming more intimate. Father Tomasz translated, "To the man called Jonathan who will read these words many years after I have gone home to my beloved, I want you to know that I have been praying for you since the day Jesus showed me your face. I have been interceding for you from heaven, asking the Father to give you strength for your sacred mission, to protect you from spiritual attacks, to surround you with people who will support your calling. You are not alone in this work. You have a friend in heaven who knows your struggle and who will continue to pray for you until the day you join us in eternity. Trust in his mercy, dear Jonathan, for it is infinite and it is yours. Your sister in Christ, Faustina. Jonathan's hand flew to the small cross around his neck. She's been praying for me, he said in wonder. For 87 years, she's been praying for me from heaven. Father Tomasz nodded, his face radiant. And she will continue to pray for you every day you fulfill this calling. You are not walking this path alone, Jonathan. God assigned you an intercessor before you were born, a saint who would hold your name before the throne of grace for your entire life and beyond. Jonathan looked at Father Tomasz with fresh tears and said the only words that seemed adequate. I surrender. Completely. Whatever he asks, wherever he leads, however long it takes. I am his, and I will serve this calling with every breath I have left. Jonathan and Father Tomasz remained in that sacred room for nearly 2 hours, neither man wanting to break the holy atmosphere that had settled over them like a blanket of peace. They spoke quietly about the implications of what had just happened, about the responsibility and privilege of carrying such a profound confirmation, about how to move forward with this knowledge without allowing pride to corrupt the purity of the calling. Father Tomasz shared that the monastery leadership had been debating for 3 years whether to contact Jonathan at all, fearing that such a revelation might burden rather than bless him, might create pressure rather than peace. But we prayed, the priest explained, and the answer kept coming back the same. Tell him. He needs to know. The time is now. Jonathan understood why they had waited. This wasn't information to be shared lightly or casually. It required spiritual maturity to receive it properly, to hold it as confirmation rather than as fuel for ego. Father, can I ask you something? Jonathan said as they prepared to leave the private room. How many people know about this diary entry? The priest's answer surprised him. Besides myself and 2 other archivists, no one. We have kept it sealed, waiting for you. The question now is, what do you want to do with this information? Do you wish to keep it private? Or do you feel called to share it? Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, considering carefully. His first instinct was to keep it completely private, to hold it as a sacred secret between himself and God. But as he prayed silently, asking for wisdom, a different answer emerged in his spirit. People need to know, he said finally. Not to glorify me, because this has nothing to do with my worthiness or my importance. But people need to know that God still speaks, that he still confirms callings in supernatural ways, that he knows each of us by name and has specific purposes for our lives that he planned before we were born. If my story can give someone else courage to trust their own calling, to persevere through their own years of struggle and doubt, then it needs to be shared. Father Tomasz smiled with deep satisfaction. That is the answer we hoped you would give. That is the answer of someone who truly understands that this revelation is not about you. It is about God's faithfulness. Before Jonathan left Poland, Father Tomasz gave him authenticated photocopies of the diary entries, along with official documentation from the Vatican archivists verifying the dates, the handwriting analysis, and the historical integrity of the documents. When you share this story, people will question its authenticity, the priest warned. They will look for reasons to dismiss it or explain it away. These documents will help those who truly seek truth to find it. Jonathan carefully placed the precious papers in his carry-on bag, knowing he was carrying proof of something most people only hope for but rarely receive: concrete, undeniable evidence that God had seen him, known him, and called him by name before the foundation of the world. The flight back to Los Angeles felt surreal, as though Jonathan was returning to his old life but as a completely different person. He kept the photocopies in his lap the entire 13 hours, periodically opening the folder to make sure it was real, that he hadn't dreamed the entire experience. The words, "His calling is secure. His purpose is ordained," kept echoing in his mind, and each time doubt tried to whisper its familiar lies, he now had a saint's handwritten testimony to silence it forever. When he finally arrived back at his apartment, the same small space where he had spent so many nights questioning and wondering, it looked different somehow, sanctified by the knowledge that God had seen him here, had documented his struggles here, had been preparing him here all along. Jonathan knelt beside his bed and prayed the same prayer he always prayed, but this time with a completely different spirit. "Lord, am I worthy?" And this time, he already knew the answer that heaven had written in 1937. In the months following his return from Poland, Jonathan began sharing the story of Saint Faustina's diary entry in carefully selected interviews and speaking engagements. Each time he told it, he watched faces transform with the same wonder he had experienced in that monastery room, as people realized that if God could write about Jonathan's calling 87 years before his birth, then God knew their callings too, had planned their purposes before time began, and was faithful to complete what he started. The story went viral across social media platforms, reaching millions of people who needed to hear that their struggles weren't random, that their closed doors were divine protection, that their years of waiting were preparation for something specific that only they could fulfill. Churches reported increased attendance as people who had given up on faith found themselves drawn back by a story that proved God was still actively involved in human lives, still speaking, still confirming, still loving with intentional precision. Jonathan returned to the chosen set with a completely different spirit, no longer burdened by the question of worthiness but empowered by the certainty of calling. His director and castmates noticed the change immediately, the way he carried himself with quiet confidence that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with resting in a truth written before he was born. He kept the photocopies of Saint Faustina's diary entry in his trailer, and before each scene where he portrayed Jesus, he would read her words again, allowing them to anchor him in the reality that this was not about his performance but about God's presence flowing through a willing vessel. Perhaps you're reading this story and wondering if God could have such a specific plan for your life. The beautiful truth that Jonathan discovered in that Polish monastery is the same truth available to every person who seeks it. God knows your name. He saw your struggles before you faced them. He documented your journey before you walked it. He assigned you a calling before you were born. The years of rejection, the closed doors, the moments of questioning whether you heard him correctly, none of it was wasted. All of it was preparation, hollowing out space in your soul for something only you can carry. Like Jonathan, you don't have to be perfect or qualified by human standards. You simply have to be willing to surrender daily, to trust that the God who planned your purpose will provide the grace to fulfill it. Saint Faustina's message to Jonathan echoes for every person who doubts their worthiness. Trust in his mercy, for it is infinite and it is yours.